Hello, everybody. Welcome to the SafeTea First podcast. This is the 7th episode for this podcast, and together with us today, we have a very special guest who will talk to us about something very new, but also a hot topic in the WSH scene, and it is the ESG. So, if you want to know more about ESG, stay tuned for this podcast. Okay, hello everybody. Hi Kajol.
Hi Amanda.
Yep, and today we have a special guest. Her name is Shen, and before I spoil you about whatever she does, maybe she will be the best person to introduce herself. So Nancy, over to you.
Thank you a lot. Hello everybody. Firstly, I want to thank about Kajol and Amanda, especially WSH Asia and the founder of WSH Asia, Raymond Watt, for these opportunities to allow me to share a little bit insight of the workplace safety and the ESG topics, right? Like I said, and Amanda just introduced me. My name is Nancy. I'm the founder and also the principal consultant for ESG and BIS solutions. A little bit background about myself. I have been working in the offshore and the shipping industry as a QHSE manager for a Norwegian shipping company for past 12 years. And I'm also a certified lead auditor for the integrated management system, including ISO 9001, 14001, and 14500. Yeah, with over more than 10 years practice on the OHSE field, right? So I have a quite recordable, trackable audit experience and a little bit in-depth knowledge on the shipping related legislations. Maybe others doesn't know too much about shipping. It's a very niche industry. For example, like International Safety Management Code, SULAS conventions, International Labour Organization requirements regarding to the human rights, right? And over the years, I'm also working with few universities on some sustainability research topics. That's how I initially start my career path or my expanding of my scope on the ESG, right? And I'm also a trainee and a lecturer in various universities in Singapore and specialize in providing the trainings on the environmental practice, environmental science, sustainability, and the ESG related topics. And I'm also one of the Global Reporting Initiative Committee, and which is so-called the GRI Standard Peer Review Committee. So with a focus to review their sector standard. And I will talk more about what is GRI. Yeah, so that's a little bit about myself, a little bit too much. Thanks for your patience.
What an impressive background you have. I think you're one of the very strong woman that we know in the industry. Tell me how you do it.
Well, it's a quite long journey, but maybe you can see me that I'm still not that old, but not that young anymore. Yeah, so I started in the shipping industry 12 years ago. It was quite challenge time, yeah. But initially, how I say that it's a luck or not luck, it's not that I choose the job because I initially come from China. So it's a job I have to choose me, So whoever allow me to work and allow me to stay in Singapore. So yeah, that's a starting point. But luckily, I get a very nice company and I'm be able to working in the oil and gas and the shipping industry for the 12 years. And like I mentioned that my starting point is from the HSE roles, right? And I'm doing the HSE audit. And the HSE is a very, very similar scope with ESG. And as for today, many organizations, their ESG roles are taken care by the HSE department. Otherwise, the ESG reporting mainly taken by the HSE department. Yeah, so HSE department contribute a very major proportion of the data into the ESG reporting. Yeah, so well, it has been quite challenging. And like last night, I talked to my friends, right? You couldn't believe a girl, with all the overalls and with the helmet and go on board a vessel to do the audit. And a lot of times when I show up and the agent or the surveyor or the auditee, they were a little bit shocked. But well, I survived until today, and then I try to convince myself, okay, ESG is a much girly job and compare with the EHS audit, So so I'm happy about what I do now. It's a long journey for 12 years, but I'm going to continue to do all this.
Wow, I really like your passion in I think we have talked to a few EHS or WSH officers and practitioners throughout our podcast, and I think everybody in safety share one thing in common, which is the passion for safety. I think everybody has this same united goal to make sure that everybody goes back safely. We have already touched on this topic for many times throughout this conversation. What essentially is ESG? To you, what do you think ESG is?
ESG is one of the topic under the very big umbrella is for the sustainability, but the ESG is specialized for companies. So it's a set of criteria to and a standard to request the company to report on. So it's a standard. So let me to talk a little bit more about the ESG. ESG actually is 3 words stand for the environment, social, and the governance, and represent, like I just said, a range of criteria that the company use and to help to run themselves responsible. And this reporting and the outcome of the ESG practice to investors and others. So as well as business owners, employees, investors, bankers, and the stakeholders, and everybody is involved in this ESG practice. ESG has gained a lot of importance among the investors, policymakers, and also other key stakeholders over the years, because it has been seen as a way to safeguard business from the future risks. We are facing a lot of risks in today, from those climate risks and also the social risks, right? Maybe we are not very aware of that, but actually it's approaching us day by day and closer. So before I talk more about ESG, right, I want to talk another concept. It's called triple bottom line. And this triple bottom line, we also call it 3P models. And this was firstly introduced as early as 1994. So, and this 3P means perfect, planet, and people. And this perfect actually is something about the company's economic performance, and this economic performance is closely linked to this J letter in the ESG, is so-called governance. And the P, another P is so-called the planet. And this planet, we are talking about environmental protections. And the other P, we are talking about people. And these people, we are talking about social human beings and the community that we are surviving in. So this is 3P, it's linked people, planet, and perfect, actually also representing this ESG 3 words, right? So ESG is not something new, but now we're just trying to converting these 3 letters into the ESG. So people think that, okay, it's something that new and the companies have to take some actions. But actually it's a pretty old concept.
Yeah, it's a pretty old concept. Coming to the 3 Ps and the ESG, now I see why that you link them up together. This would have already explained why ESG is important from as early as 1994. You mentioned in your introduction that ESG is also very important or very closely linked to workplace safety and health practitioners, especially in the Southeast Asia region, in Singapore in particular. So can you tell us why is it important for workplace safety and health practitioners to adopt this in their workplace?
Sure. Traditionally, when we talk about sustainability, right, and most people are thinking about, okay, ESG is part of the sustainability. And when we talk about sustainability, we are thinking something about green and the environment. And we think that, okay, that's about environmental issues. Why our HSE department have to be involved, right? And that's about global warming, that's about sea level rise, and how, based on my own effort and as an individual, how I can contribute to this broad and big things, right? However, we have to think, right, with this 3P model and converting to the ESG topics nowadays for the business, it's not just for the environment. right? We're also talking about the human rights, about the labor market, about the workers' benefits. Workplace safety and health are crucial for the sustainable development for the business, especially for smaller and private organizations. Workers' health and safety plays a key role in an organization's economic performance, right? We know it as a safety professionals. One incident, if it's a major incident, most of the time that it can even lead to the organizations to bankrupt, right? So based on the ILO's or International Labour Organization estimate, about 2.3 million workers die from the work-related injuries and disease every year. And another additional 160 million workers suffer from non-fatal work-related disease and 330 million from non-fatal injury every year. And based on these numbers, right, we can see that how big and huge economic payoff and cost to the company and economic itself, right? So about almost 2.8 trillion of US dollars is lost due to direct and indirect cost of such incident and disease. Meanwhile, there's also statistically shows, due to the poor OHS performance, employers' loss is about 1/5 of the loss, such as the staff turnover cost, training cost, loss of production, insurance, and even more legal expenses they have to cover. But when it comes to the employees and the workers, it's about 50% loss. So about more than half of the loss is suffered by the worker ourselves. So which including about loss of the incomings, about the medical treatment, and also some injuries, rehabilitations after the injuries. So we all gone through the period, right? Like COVID-19 since 2019, 2020, 2021, right? And we all suffer about this period from the circuit breaker. And we realize that, this small virus, we cannot see that, but it's already infect our economies and our employment rate. And a lot of people are losing the job from it. And we see that the construction, manufacturing are being affected. And when we come to the COVID-19 risks, right? And we ask ourselves and those safety practitioners, who is the department taking care of the COVID-19 safety measures in the workplace? That's taken care by the OHSE department, right? And this, the occupational health and about this profit and the loss is all taken by the organization, by the employer ourselves. So we can see that work health problems are result in about 4 to 6% of the gross domestic production, we call it GDP loss for most of the countries. So poor workplace health and safety management is directly impact the company's economic growth, and which also maybe affect about the investors' interest to invest more to the company. So if we want the business to be profitable and sustainable, we need to make sure that all these WSH risks have been properly evaluated, and all these operational risks, environmental risks, as well as the social risks, and have to go back to a way in the sustainable way and being managed. And another thing is about basic human rights. We may not face that too much in Singapore, but we saw a lot of cases in Southeast Asia about this child labor, modern slavery, that's all related to the company's performance, and all these things are being exposed to the company and about their reputation day by day. So by saying that, all these social factors, HSE, play a very major role in the EHS reporting practice. Another note I want to highlight, in the GRI standard is one of the key standards is being used nowadays and widely adopted by the companies for the ESG reporting practice in Singapore and the worldwide. About 95% of the companies are using the GRI standard. And among the GRI standards, they are divided into the environment, social, and the governance reporting. And a big portion reporting is from the social part. And among this social part, HSE reporting play a major proportion under this reporting statistics. So that's why ESG and HSE, they are very closely linked to each other.
I heard about the statistics that you were talking about, and you were sharing, about workplace injuries and health problems. When you told me, my mind was blown because that's way too much. You also linked economy and profit to sustainability. So I just want to know, is ESG very closely related to investment? If yes, why do you think so? And if no, why do you think so?
Okay, when we talk about the investment, right, we have to talk about who wants this investment. It's business owners. And let's go back about one step behind, right? So why the business owners want to set up the business? So we can also ask ourselves, right? If one day we want to set up a business, we want to do something, well, why we want to do that? It's only one word. I always ask my students in the class, if you want to do something by yourself, if you want to set up a business, why you want to do it? So make money, right? So it's a primary role for the business about making money, right? And we are talking about making the profit. So it's very, very obviously like 100% of the business owners, when they set up the business, they want to making money. They want the profit. Yeah. And they also need investors, right? To think about, okay, I need some investors when I don't have the money, when I don't have enough money to set up my business. But for investors, if you ask your parents, I need to set up this business, and then your dad will ask you, right? Okay, what's my return for my investment, right? So he also want to invest in some company who are performing very well, right? And he wants to make sure that, okay, my money goes to the right place, and I will see my money is growing, right? So, in the past, when the investors are trying to evaluate whether the company is doing well or doing not well, what do they say? They see their cash flow book, right? They say this. They are trying to see their accounting performance, financial performance. So they are checking about the cash flow, about your debt, about the profit and any profit and the loss for the companies, right? And another thing, the investors nowadays is not only just a concern about, okay, your financial things, your financial performance can doing very well. They also have to think about, how about the company's reputation? Are you doing the right things? Are you going to contribute to this society? So if you are not going to contribute to the society that much, probably you are only earning the quick money, right? But investors also want the money, to be sustainable. I put in my money here today. I also want this money is generating the profit in another 10 years, right? So investors are major concern is about putting the right money in the right place and to growing the money day by day. So they want to make sure that their investment goes to the right direction. So in this way, in the past, their risk evaluation is based on the numbers, but now it's no longer based on the numbers. So their risk assessment is how to check about your social compliance. Are you using the child labors? Are you using the modern slaveries? How's your safety management? If your safety management is not good, so maybe I have to pay and I have to share the burden for your safety incident. And another thing is, are you taking care of about those environmental factors, For example, like sea level rise. If you are going to use my money to building up a sea villa, and which is very, very close to the sea level rise locations, and maybe 1 or 2 years later, the villa going to be flushed down, right? All over the years, we see that a lot of climate refugees, a lot of people are suffering from this risks. So another thing is business also have to see that, okay, are you my money is going to put in here, are you going to do something legal and compliance with the government regulations, right? And investors are also trying to increasingly applying those non-financial factors with a blended of the ESG factors as part of their analysis process. So whether the business is sustainable or not, and whether they really identify their material risks and growth opportunities. So like I have mentioned, nowadays there are a lot of standards are actually available for investors to refer to check whether they are doing the responsible investment, which including the Sustainability Accounting Standard Board, SASB, which is very, very popular in America, and also the Global Reporting Initiatives in Netherlands, and the very, very popular use in Southeast Asia for reporting practice. And in the beginning of this year, Singapore Stock Exchange is also requested all the companies is to adopt another new standards for their ESG reporting disclosures at so-called TCFDs, which is so-called Task Force of Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So you can see from this full name, there's a financial disclosures. So you can see that all these climate-related things and ESG-related things is clearly related to the company's financial performance. And I want to mention about one word to conclude about this part. These days when we're talking about the ESG, when we're talking about environmental risk, when we're talking about this social risks, right? I said another example, the carbon tax in Singapore is going to increase from $5 to $25 to $40, and eventually it's going to the $80. So I just want to highlight one word is about who care, who will win the game.
Wow, I like your last line. Whoever cares, they win. I think that's something that is really true. Looking at it globally, I think everyone is starting to implement ESG and taking it more seriously. So do you, Nancy, see a trend in the implementation of ESG in the SEA region?
Yes, yeah. So, I can see a very, very big trend about the ESG in this region. One part I want to highlight, maybe you have some young generations, maybe they are lost about looking for the jobs. There are a lot of job opportunities in this ESG field. So you can see that where's the demand. Yeah, so there's a high demand here. And another things I want to highlight that why ESG is a rising trend and a higher demand in Southeast Asia regions. It's not just because, to meet the regulatory requirements. Of course, regulatory requirements compliance is always one of the major regions to drive the ESG performance and to drive the business to starting to take actions. However, it's also driven by the investors, like we just mentioned that investors is cause for the responsible investment. So when we come to the investors, and the bank is also plays a big part, right? Because most of the business, when they are setting up in a certain scale, they need to get in the loan from the bank. And we heard about this word about green bond, right? Green loans, right? And when you are implementing these ESG factors in your business and in your within your investment and business directions, and the banking actually will consider about the interest rate. So when the interest rate is lower, so the business owners will lower their expenses, right, for their business. So this is a part of the companies and how they evaluate the ESG. So when the bankers and the investors come into the picture, they will check about the company's ESG ratings. So when they check about the ESG ratings, the company first they need to report it, and then they need to implement it. So that's how it happens. And another thing is, over my experience, I also see that a lot of companies, they are doing the ESG reportings. Let's say not those big companies, but those companies are not very exposed to the market. Why they still need to do the ESG implementations? Because of the supply chain. And this when we talk about this carbon, when we talk about this labor, it's all about across the value chain and the supply chain. So all the big companies, they need to make sure that their product is sustainable and responsible for these societies. So how they can get this data to be evaluated and to be verified? They will do the supplier assessment. And when they do this supplier assessment, their suppliers need to prepare for the ESG reporting performance. To sum up, 3 major factors are causing the trends of the ESG implementations in Asia. One is compliance. Another one is about investor request, and the last one is about the supply chain.
Wow, okay, that sums up very comprehensive, and it also tells us that when you mention about ESG having to be compliant to certain standards, and you also mentioned that there are some standards out there in the market that is closely followed. I think it's SASB, GRI, and also the one that is the one by the Task Force Climate.
TCFD, yeah.
It's the 3 major standards that everybody follows. So from your experience, right, I mean, listening to you, my biggest challenge would be, how am I going to make sure that I comply to all these different standards? But coming from your experience, as you audit these companies out there, what do you think are the biggest challenges these companies face when they try to implement ESG in their workplace?
It's still relatively new, and if you go and check about the ESG courses, probably it's not one of the major courses in the universities, and there's no course in the universities is calling about ESG, degree of the ESG, master of the ESG. So this highlights my first point I want to mention, that there's a resource shortage. One is from the education side. There's a resource shortage. So there's limited trainings, and once this trainings is rolling out to the market, it also takes time for the people to get trained, right? And another thing I want to highlight is about when I was working as a research assistant and the researchers. So I realized that, there's a lack of the standards and the plannings and the regulations in the market. There are few standards, like I just mentioned about SASB, GRI, and also United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and also like the TCFDs. But which guidelines the organization they should choose? There are so many indicators. So when it comes to the business owners, they may a little bit lost. Which standard I should choose, and will this standard and these indicators really fits my companies? So nowadays, most of the companies, they are trying to pick up some low-hanging fruit. So whatever the thing is available, they report. It's not based on whatever it need to be reported. So most of the companies, they are choosing this low-hanging fruit to report. So this calls for organizations for standard settings. They should set up standards and to request for certain sectors to report in the certain elements. And I can see that this is on the way. And I'm also the committee of the reviewing panels and one of the major standard setting committees. So it is on the way. And another thing is also about the commitment from the leadership in the organizations. In the early of this year, Singapore Stock Exchange (SGX) they requested that all the senior leaderships in the organization, which are directors and independent directors, should go through one time of the sustainability and ESG trainings. And which is a good news, we know that once they start to getting such trainings, they will starting to put more attention on the ESG reporting. They no longer treat the ESG implementation as a cost. They know that how important and how critical it is. Sometimes the director just treat it like a task that on my checklist. So at the end of the year, I need to take it to finish it. The key challenge is awareness among the key stakeholders. One key stakeholder is employee. So all the things I have mentioned is about the leadership plays a critical role for that. But another thing is about the employee. They need to know about, as a responsible organization and the companies, how I can contribute. In this way, it's not just like a one-man show and a one-man's job in the organization. So everybody will take the responsibility to make.
You were mentioning like the lack of research and lack of knowledge, and you still believe that we can go towards implementing ESG in the workplace, which I think it's really, really the future of the industry as well. Let's look at the employee stand and also the employer stand point of view. How do you think, in your opinion, that all of us can do better in ensuring the implementation of ESG?
Yeah, just to continue what you have mentioned, although I have mentioned about there are so many challenges, but why I still believe it, because when it comes to those common risks and like environmental risks, when it happens, nobody can actually avoid it. So that's why it's calling for everybody's effort, and we have to believe that we have a solution for that. And another thing is about social, about human beings. So when we make it come true, so that means every employee, every human being's benefits has been protected is in a much higher level. So that's why I keep it positive, because I think a better word is going to come, Yeah, so continue your question about the employees stand and how the employer can do, right? From the employer, I think, they need to provide more resources such as training, leadership commitment, and setting a very direct directions for the organizations. And also they must be very proactive to accept about this new change. For example, like in reducing the human risks, in reducing the carbon emissions, and in providing a better working environment like the lighting, ventilations for the employees. And for employees, what they can do, employees, they have to accept this change. And they cannot say that, okay, now you come up from the ISO, then WSH about those safety measures. Now you come up, you ask me to do something new things about ESG, right? They cannot treat it as an extra task. And ESG itself, although it's like what you mentioned in the very beginning, it's a new term for us, but it's not something rocket science. It's very, very close to our life. Actually, we're already doing so, but we have a lot of companies, they have family day. So that's part of the social. A lot of companies, they have, tree plant days. That's part of the environment, right? So, but at the end, ESG, how to driven it from the employee side, it should become their KPI in their job performance. Then it could probably happen. Employee has to do something. Out of the ESG indicators, I have mentioned it's about almost 50% of the indicators. It's talking about protecting the employees. So employees should know that if my company is doing well in the ESG, and that means I'm being protected, and my social well-being, my health well-being is going to be protected, and I'm going to get the right parental leave. If one day I'm going to lay off, I'm going to get the right money and the right notice period and under the contract to protect myself. So that's, employee must be one part of it to not only take the action, but also to monitor it to make sure it's going to happen. So ESG should be embedded in our daily job for both employer and employees, and they should know that how their operation is closely linked to this.
Thank you, Nancy. That was a very in-depth view about the employer and employees' stand on what we can do in ESG. I think I have a very good understanding on what ESG is at the moment. I know there are complications as to how we can put this all together with the different standards that are there. But before we end this episode about ESG, any last words, any tips, any advice that you'd like to give to our safety professionals or anyone listening to our podcast today if they want to work towards the implementation of ESG at their workplace? Anything you have to say to them?
Okay, I only have 3 words. I want to cut it short. It's involvement, commitment, and engagement. And my first suggestion is about ESG is not just about the top-down approach. It also need to be from the bottom-up approach to ensure that the entire organizations are commitment towards the ESG, right? In order to achieve this, all levels of the employees need to be involved, and they need to know their primary roles, how they can contribute to the ESGs. And so to driven this, I have mentioned that maybe linked to their KPIs, to their bonus or something, right? And another thing is about, it's about the commitment. So you need to make sure that this commitment is for myself and for a better myself, and all this commitment should directly coming from the leadership support, strategy settings, and like policy settings. And the last one is about engagement. So everybody need to be engaged on that. So it's not just like, year-end exercise when I starting need to report about, okay, the reporting process is starting, the audit is starting, so I need to do it. So the ESG things need everybody to show the certain levels of the engagement. And this engagement need to be 24/7 throughout the whole year.
Wow. Thanks, Nancy. Thank you so much for sharing about ESG and sustainability today. We learned so much from you today. So we'd like to thank you so much for joining us in our podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So if you have any topics or questions you'd like the Safety First podcast to cover, please feel free to get in touch with us. Remember to like, subscribe, and share this podcast episode to whoever you think needs it. So thank you, everyone.